The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Maeve Callister buried her last patient, and the same day she decided she was done running from her own life. She'd been the only doctor in Harrow's Bend for 3 years, which wasn't the kind of town that lets you leave quietly. Population 412, one general store, one church, one saloon that called itself a social club because the Reverend had complained. The kind of place where everybody knew what you'd had for breakfast and offered opinions on whether you'd eaten enough. The letter was from a lawyer in Cheyenne named Horace Delaney. Short, dry, precise. A man named Theodore Crane had died. He had a son 9 years old, name of Samuel. The boy's mother had been gone for 6 years. There was no other family. The ranch would pass to the boy, but a boy couldn't manage a ranch. The court needed someone to serve as guardian until Samuel was 16. Theodore Crane had listed one name, hers. Maeve read the letter twice, standing at her kitchen table, still wearing her coat, the winter mud from the cemetery not yet dry on her boots. She hadn't seen Theodore Crane in 4 years. They'd spent one summer together, the summer after she'd finished her medical training, when she'd been working at the county hospital, and he'd come in with a broken wrist from a thrown horse. He'd called her brilliant and said she laughed too loud, and she'd told him he was too proud to admit when he was hurting. They'd argued more than anything else, but they'd understood each other in the particular way of two people who both learned to need nobody. Then she'd taken the position in Harrow's Bend, and he'd gone back to his ranch outside the town of Dalton Creek, and they'd exchanged a handful of letters over the years that said nothing much and meant more than she'd admitted to herself. His last letter had come 8 months ago. He'd mentioned Samuel was growing fast. He'd mentioned the winter had been hard. He hadn't mentioned being sick. She sat down. She thought about Samuel Crane, 9 years old, who had just lost the only parent he'd ever known. She thought about a boy she'd treated in Harrow's Bend 2 years ago, 10 years old, who'd come to her office with a fever his father kept insisting was nothing. She'd seen the bruising. She'd written the letter to the county sheriff and then waited 3 days to send it. Because she wasn't sure, because she didn't want to be wrong, because she was afraid of what happened if she interfered, and she was wrong. By the time she sent it, the boy had run. They'd found him 2 days later in a barn outside town, half frozen, one eye swollen shut. He'd survived. He'd been placed with a family in the next county. She'd heard he was doing fine. She still woke up sometimes thinking about those 3 days. She wrote back to Horace Delaney the same afternoon. She asked what exactly Theodore had intended by listing her name. The response came fast, as if the lawyer had been expecting hesitation. Theodore Crane had left a letter for her specifically. Delaney enclosed it. Theodore's handwriting was worse than she remembered. He'd known, near the end, that the illness was serious. He'd written to Delaney 6 weeks before he died. The letter to Maeve was shorter. "You're the only person I ever met who treats every person like they matter the same," he'd written. "Samuel needs someone like that. Not someone who will manage him. Someone who will actually see him. I know it's a lot to ask. I know we weren't anything official. But I'm asking anyway." She was on the train to Dalton Creek 4 days later. The Crane Ranch sat at the base of a long ridge, sheltered from the worst of the Wyoming wind by a stand of old cottonwoods along the eastern fence. It was a working ranch, or it had been. She could see that some things had fallen behind. A section of fence needed mending. The barn door hung slightly crooked on its hinge. But the house itself was solid. 2 stories of weathered timber with a covered porch, smoke rising from the chimney. The lawyer Delaney met her at the station and drove her out in his wagon. He was a small man with careful eyes, and the kind of voice that had learned over many years not to betray surprise at anything. He told her the ranch hand, a man named Porter who'd worked for Theodore for 12 years, had been keeping things going since the death. He told her Samuel was being kept at the neighboring property, a family named Whitfield, but that the Whitfields had their own 4 children and couldn't take him permanently. He told her the county judge, a man named Alistair Vance, wanted to speak with her before any guardianship was finalized. He told her this last thing in a tone that suggested it would be a conversation, not a formality. The Whitfield place was a mile down the road. Samuel Crane was sitting on the front step when the wagon pulled up, and he didn't move when they stopped. He was small for 9, with his father's dark coloring and a stillness about him that didn't look like peace, that looked like a child who'd learned to wait and see before trusting anything. Maeve climbed down from the wagon before Delaney had fully stopped. She walked to the step and crouched down so she was level with the boy. "Samuel," she said, "my name is Maeve. Your father and I were friends. I know who you are." His voice was flat. "He talked about you." "What did he say?" A pause. He looked at her the way children look at adults when they're deciding whether to bother. "He said you were stubborn and that you were good at your work and that he should have written more often." Her throat closed. "He was right about all three," she said. Something shifted slightly in the boy's face. Not warmth, not yet, but a small, careful recalibration. "I don't need someone to take care of me," Samuel said. "I'm not little." "I know, but the ranch does." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he stood up, picked up the bag that was apparently already packed beside the door, and walked toward the wagon. Mrs. Whitfield appeared in the doorway behind him, wiping her hands on her apron, her face a complicated mixture of relief and guilt. "He's a good boy," she said quietly to Maeve. "He doesn't complain. He just goes very still sometimes." Maeve nodded. She knew what that kind of stillness cost a child. Judge Alistair Vance's office smelled like pipe tobacco and old paper. He was a broad man in his 60s with a white mustache and eyes that had seen enough human behavior to be either cynical or compassionate, and had apparently settled on some combination of both. He had the guardianship papers on his desk. He did not immediately offer them to her. "You're a doctor," he said. "Single woman, no permanent property in Dalton Creek, no prior relationship with the child." "Theodore trusted me," Maeve said. "Theodore is dead. My obligation is to the living boy." Vance leaned back in his chair. "I've spoken with Mrs. Whitfield. She says Samuel hasn't slept more than a few hours together since his father passed. Won't cry in front of anyone, spends his time in the barn with the horses." He paused. "I've also sent a letter to the county board in Harrow's Bend about your work there. 3 years, good record, no complaints of note." "Then what's the problem?" "The problem," Vance said, "is that a single woman as sole guardian of a ranch-owning minor creates legal complications. The ranch hands won't take direction easily. The bank has questions about who manages the estate accounts, and there are 2 men in this county who've already made inquiries about acquiring the Crane property, and they'll make your life difficult if they think they can pressure you out." He looked at her steadily. "A married woman in your position has more standing. Legally. Practically." The words sat in the air between them. "I'm not married," Maeve said. "No," Vance agreed. "You're not." She looked at him. "You're not suggesting what it sounds like you're suggesting." "I'm telling you the lay of the land," Vance said evenly. "I'm not telling you what to do with that information. I'll approve the guardianship on the merits. But I want you to know what you're walking into." She left his office with the papers signed and a feeling in her chest that was not quite certainty and not quite dread. Porter had worked the Crane Ranch since before Samuel was born. He was a weathered man, somewhere between 45 and 60, hard to place exactly, with a limp from an old injury and the particular loyalty of someone who'd chosen a place and meant it. He met Maeve on the porch the first morning with coffee and no opinion about whether she belonged there. "What needs doing first?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment. Then he told her. She was not a rancher. She knew this. Porter knew this. Samuel, watching from the barn doorway, almost certainly knew this. But she had spent 3 years in a frontier town treating everything from snakebite to difficult births to a man who'd convinced himself he could treat a gunshot wound with whiskey and stubbornness. And she had learned how to walk into rooms where she wasn't expected and ask the right questions and listen to the answers. The fence got mended. The barn door got rehung. She reviewed the estate accounts with Delaney and found them in better shape than she'd feared. Because Theodore had been careful with money even when he hadn't been careful with his own health. Samuel watched all of it from a careful distance. He ate what was put in front of him. He did his chores without complaint. At night, she could hear him sometimes. Not crying, just awake, moving around his room with the particular quietness of a child trying not to be heard. On the 4th night, she knocked on his door. "Can't sleep?" she asked. "I'm fine." "I know you are." She sat down in the hallway with her back against the wall outside his door because she wasn't going to push her way in. "I can't either. I keep thinking about things I should have said to your father when I had the chance." A long silence. Like what? Samuel asked, through the door. Like that I was glad he wrote to me, even when the letters didn't say much. She paused. I think I was waiting for the right moment to say it directly, and the right moment didn't come. Another silence. Then the door opened a crack, and Samuel looked out at her, sitting on the floor in her nightgown like a person with no dignity, which she felt was probably the correct approach. He said you were the best doctor he'd ever met, Samuel said. And he'd met a lot because he hated going to the doctor, so he put it off, and then things were usually worse by the time he went. That sounds exactly like him. Something close to a smile crossed Samuel's face. It disappeared quickly, like he wasn't sure he was allowed. I miss him, the boy said very quietly, as if admitting it might break something. I know, Maeve said. Me too. Samuel sat down on his side of the doorway. They stayed like that for a while, not quite together and not quite apart, until he fell asleep leaning against the doorframe, and she carried him back to his bed without waking him. The two men Vance had mentioned were named Clifton Marsh and Edgar Hollis. Marsh ran the larger cattle operation in the county. Hollis was his business partner in various enterprises that the county's better citizens described as dealings, in a tone that said everything without saying anything specific. They appeared at the ranch 3 weeks after Maeve arrived in a good wagon with matched horses, dressed like men who expected to be taken seriously. She met them on the porch. Marsh was smooth in the way of men who'd spent decades getting what they wanted through apparent reasonableness. He said he understood she'd found herself in a complicated situation. He said the Crane property was a fine piece of land, but a lot to manage for a woman alone. He said he'd be willing to make a very fair offer. The ranch isn't for sale, Maeve said. Everything's for sale, Hollis said. He wasn't trying to be smooth. He'd apparently decided that wasn't necessary. Not this, she said. They left. She watched the wagon go and then went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hands flat on the table, breathing steadily, because she was not going to let two men with good horses make her feel like she was standing on someone else's ground. Porter appeared in the doorway. He'd watched the whole thing from the barn. They'll be back, he said. I know. Vance told me what he said to you, about your situation. Porter picked up the coffee pot and poured a cup without asking if she wanted one, which she did. He's not wrong about the practical side of it. Hollis has a judge in his pocket over in the next county, as since that judge's cattle mysteriously didn't die in the drought 3 years back. Maeve wrapped her hands around the cup. I'm not getting married to solve a legal problem. No, Porter said. I don't expect you are. She looked at him. But there's a man named Corbett Hale, who farms about 6 miles north. Has about 200 acres, good land. Manages it alone since his wife passed 2 years back. Decent man. Doesn't drink. Doesn't bother people. Lost his wife to fever and hasn't been the same since by most accounts. But he shows up when there's trouble and he minds what's his. Porter set down the coffee pot. He came to Theodore's funeral. Stayed to help with the horses after. Didn't say much. You're describing a man to me. I'm telling you about a neighbor, Porter said, with a precision that managed to be both technically accurate and completely transparent. She didn't say anything for a moment. Samuel needs stability, Porter continued. Legal stability, the kind that doesn't depend on two men with good horses deciding not to push. Samuel needs a home, Maeve said, not a strategy. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive. She thought about Vance's office. The papers she'd signed. The particular weight of being the only thing standing between a 9-year-old boy and two men who considered everything negotiable. Tell me more about Corbett Hale, she said. He came to the fence line the next week, because apparently Porter had said something to someone, and news traveled the way it always did in ranch country, which was faster than seemed physically possible. She was mending the east fence with Samuel, when she looked up and saw a man on a gray horse watching from the road. Corbett Hale was not what she'd expected, though she'd tried not to form expectations. He was tall, not massively so, but solidly built, with the kind of stillness that came from years of working alone. He had a careful face, the kind that had once been more open and had learned to be less so. He got down from the horse and came to the fence. I heard you were here, he said. Thought I'd come by. I knew Theodore. I know. Porter mentioned you. Something moved across his face. Awareness, maybe, that this conversation was not entirely what it appeared to be on the surface. He looked at Samuel, who was watching him with the same careful assessment he gave everything. "I'm Samuel," the boy said. "I know. Your father talked about you." Samuel absorbed this. "Everyone keeps saying that." "It's because it's true," Corbett said. "He was proud of you." Samuel went back to the fence post he'd been working on, which Maeve had come to understand was his way of processing things he didn't want to let show on his face. She and Corbett Hale stood at the fence and talked about practical things. The east pasture, the condition of the creek, whether the winter had damaged the upper field. He answered her questions without condescension, which she noted, and he asked questions of his own that were genuine, not performative. When he left, Samuel watched the gray horse disappear up the road. "He didn't try to make me feel better," the boy said. "No. Most people try to make me feel better. They say things like they know my father's in a better place, and they're sure things will be okay." He picked up a fencing tool. "They don't know that." "No," Maeve agreed. "They don't." Samuel glanced at her sideways. "He just talked to me like I was a person." "Yes, he did." Corbett came back 3 days later with a wagon of posts because he'd noticed the north fence was worse than the east and hadn't said anything about it at the time, but had apparently gone home and thought about it. He and Porter worked through the afternoon. Maeve brought out coffee and then stayed to help, because she wasn't the kind of person who brought coffee and went back inside. He didn't ask her about her intentions with the ranch. He didn't ask about Marsh and Hollis, though she suspected he knew. He talked about his own place in the matter-of-fact way of a person who doubted something themselves and respected the same in others. His wife's name had been Josephine. He didn't offer this information. It came out sideways when Samuel asked about the carved wooden horse he had hanging from his saddle horn. "Josie made that," he said. "She carved things. Said it was for keeping her hands busy in the evenings." Samuel held the little horse carefully and handed it back. "My father carves things too," he said. "I have them in my room." Corbett nodded. He didn't say anything else about it, and Maeve appreciated that he understood the boy wasn't looking for comfort. He was looking for recognition, acknowledgement that the things that mattered to him were real. On the fourth visit, she asked him directly. They were standing by the water trough after the work was done, Porter and Samuel having gone in for supper. The last of the daylight going gold along the ridge. "You know what people are saying," she said, "about why you keep coming by." Corbett looked at the trough. "I expect I do. And you know what Marsh and Hollis are after." "I've known Hollis since he tried to buy my water rights 4 years ago." He paused. "I said no, then too." She looked at him. He was not looking at her, which she appreciated, because it felt less like being examined. "I'm not looking for a marriage," she said. "I'm looking for Samuel to have a stable home and a legal position that's not vulnerable to 2 men with a county judge in their pocket." "I understand. I need you to understand clearly. I'm a doctor. I intend to keep practicing. I have opinions that I don't moderate. Well, I've been told I'm difficult." "By who?" "Several people whose opinions I respect." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. "I've been told I'm too quiet." "That sounds manageable." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Josie died of fever. It was fast. 6 days from the first symptom. There wasn't anything to be done, but I've spent 2 years wondering if there was something I missed." He looked at the ridge. "I'm not looking for a marriage either, but I'm also not opposed to doing something that helps a boy who didn't choose to be in this situation, if the terms are clear between us." "What terms do you need?" she asked. "That you tell me if something I'm doing makes things harder instead of letting it build until it breaks." Josie said I needed to be told things directly. She was right. I can do that. And that whatever this is, it's honest, not to Vance or the lawyers, to each other. She met his eyes. "Yes." "And the boy," Corbett said. "He comes first." "He always comes first," Maeve said. "That's not a condition, that's the point." He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Then let's figure out what this looks like." They went to Judge Vance together 2 weeks later. Corbett in his good coat, which had clearly not been worn recently. Maeve in her best dress, which she'd bought in Harrow's Bend for occasions requiring professional credibility and had never entirely stopped feeling like a costume. Vance looked at them both for a long moment. "This wasn't what I suggested," he said. No, Maeve said, but it answers the problem. You've known this man. He checked his papers. Less than a month. Theodore listed my name as guardian, knowing he'd been dead before I could make any arrangements, Maeve said. I think he understood that doing the right thing sometimes requires moving faster than is comfortable. Vance sat back. He looked at Corbett. And you? I knew Theodore Crane for 11 years, Corbett said. The boy deserves better than having two men acquire his land out from under him because his guardian's legal position is shaky. If my involvement stabilizes that, I'm willing. Willing is not exactly a romantic endorsement, Vance said dryly. No, Corbett agreed, but it's an honest one. The judge looked between them. Something in his expression shifted from skepticism toward something more like respect. I'll need the standard waiting period, he said. 14 days. Then we can finalize both the guardianship and the marriage registration simultaneously. He looked at Maeve. That boy in there better be well cared for. He will be, she said. I promise you that. Samuel did not react the way she'd expected. She'd sat him down that evening at the kitchen table with Corbett present, because it was his life and he deserved to be told the truth. She explained the situation as simply as she could. What Marsh and Hollis wanted, what Judge Vance had said, what she and Corbett had decided, and why. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You're doing it for the ranch, he said, not accusatory, just locating the information in his understanding. For the ranch and for your legal position, Maeve said. But also because Corbett is a good man who knew your father, and I'd rather you have more people in your corner than fewer. Do you like each other? Maeve looked at Corbett. Yes, Corbett said. I respect her. That's real, even if the rest of it is complicated. Samuel absorbed this. He looked at the table. Then he looked at Corbett. Do you know how to teach someone to fish? He asked. Porter knows, but he said he'd teach me in spring, and then he got busy, and then my father died, and... He stopped. I know how to fish, Corbett said. There's a good creek on my property. We can go this weekend if you want. Samuel nodded. He stood up and started to go to his room, then stopped in the doorway. I know it's not real, he said, without turning around, but I won't tell anyone. Maeve's throat ached. It's real enough, she said. The part that matters. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend on a Wednesday morning, with Porter and Mrs. Whitfield as witnesses, and Samuel standing beside Maeve with his best shirt on, which was slightly too short in the sleeves because he'd grown since his father bought it. There was no speech and no celebration afterward, just coffee at the house and a pie Mrs. Whitfield had brought, and then Corbett went back to his own farm because they hadn't yet worked out what the daily arrangement would look like, and everyone needed time to figure that out. Maeve sat on the porch that evening. Samuel came and sat on the step below her. Are you okay? He asked. She looked at this 9-year-old boy who'd buried his father and packed his bag and climbed into a wagon without complaint, and was now asking her if she was all right. I'm okay, she said. Thank you for asking. You look like you're thinking hard about something. I am. She paused. I'm thinking about whether I made the right choice. Did you? I think so. I don't know yet for certain. He nodded. He picked up his stick and drew a line in the dirt at the base of the step, then smoothed it out. My father used to say, you can't know if something's right until you see how it goes, Samuel said. He said most people who think they always know are just good at deciding they were right after the fact. She thought about Theodore, writing her name in a document from his sickbed, trusting her with his son's life. Your father was smarter than he let on, she said. I know, Samuel said. I just wish he'd let on more. Corbett came by 2 mornings a week at first, and then 3, and then it became harder to track because the line between visiting and simply being there had blurred somewhere along the way. He and Porter worked out a comfortable understanding without much discussion. He and Samuel went fishing on the weekend he'd promised, came back with 4 decent-sized fish, and Samuel talking more than she'd heard him talk since arriving. He did not try to be Samuel's father. He was scrupulously careful about that. He asked questions. He offered information when it was wanted. He was present without pushing. Maeve watched all of it and thought that Theodore had been right about him the same way Theodore had apparently been right about her, which was that some people were worth trusting even when trusting people was the harder thing. She and Corbett talked in the evenings, sometimes on the porch, sometimes at the table after Samuel had gone to bed. He was quieter than she was, which she'd expected, but he listened in a way that wasn't passive. He remembered what she said and came back to it later. He told her once, about 3 weeks in, that Josephine had said he had trouble asking for help, and he'd been trying to get better at it. "Are you asking for help now?" Maeve said. "I don't know what I'm doing now," he said, "but I'm not pretending it's straightforward." "Good," she said. "Neither am I." The trouble with Hollis came in late October. He and Marsh arrived at the ranch with a man Maeve didn't know who turned out to be a lawyer, and they had a document claiming a prior lien on the property that predated Theodore's ownership, which was either legitimate or manufactured, and either way was going to require answering. She sent Porter for Delaney and sat the 3 men on the porch and told them she'd read whatever they wanted her to read and then she'd have an answer for them. Hollis looked at her with the particular expression of a man who'd expected a different kind of resistance. "You might want to consult with your husband first," he said, putting a faint emphasis on the last word that managed to make it both an acknowledgement and a mockery. "I'm a doctor and a legal guardian," Maeve said. "I don't need to consult anyone before I read a document." Corbett appeared at the end of the porch. She hadn't heard him arrive, but Porter must have sent word. He stood there without saying anything. The 3 men looked at him. He looked back. "Morning," he said, to nobody in particular. Delaney arrived 40 minutes later, read the document, and informed them that the lien in question had been settled and discharged 9 years prior, and that the paperwork existed in the county record office, and he would be happy to retrieve it. He said this pleasantly, as if it were not a significant legal threat that had just been disassembled in their presence. Marsh and Hollis and their lawyer left. After Maeve found Corbett in the barn helping Samuel with the horses, because apparently that was where he'd gone to wait out the legal situation. "You didn't have to come," she said. "I know." He ran a brush along the bay mare's flank. "I wanted to." She stood in the barn doorway and thought about that for a moment. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and kept brushing, which was not the same as minimizing it. It was just Corbett, not needing to make more of a moment than it already was. Samuel asked her one night in November whether she thought his father had known what would happen. Not about dying, about what came after. "I think he knew he was making a gamble," Maeve said. "I think he trusted the people he'd picked and hoped it would work out." Did he know about Corbett? I don't know. Maybe he knew the kind of person Corbett was and trusted that people like that tend to find each other. Samuel thought about this. "Do you think he'd be glad about how things are now?" She thought about Theodore's letter. "I know it's a lot to ask. The handwriting worse than she remembered." "Yes," she said. "I think he'd be very glad." Samuel went to bed. Maeve sat by the fire a while longer. Corbett knocked on the back door around 8, which had become a kind of habit neither of them had formally agreed to. She handed him coffee, and he sat across the table, and they talked about the fence repair and the winter supplies situation, and whether Samuel's reading was where it should be for his age. And it was ordinary and quiet, and she realized exactly what she'd been missing without knowing it. "I need to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I've been thinking about Josie less," he said carefully. "Not like I'm forgetting her. But I wake up in the mornings now, and the first thing I think about isn't what I lost, it's what's happening today." He looked at his hands. "I didn't expect that." She didn't say anything for a moment. "Is that okay?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "It's okay. I just wanted to say it directly, the way I should say things." She looked at him across the table. This man who showed up with fence posts and didn't try to explain grief away and taught a 9-year-old to fish, and was here now, telling her something true because he'd decided she deserved honest things. "I've been thinking about Clara less," she said. "Not less often, but with less weight. Like I'm still carrying it. But it's not all I can feel." She paused. "I think that's what it means to actually be somewhere instead of just hiding in a place." He was quiet. "Is that what you're doing here?" he asked. "Not hiding?" "I'm trying," she said. "This is the first time in 4 years I've tried." He nodded. He didn't push further, because he wasn't a man who needed to close every door before he was ready. And that was something she'd grown to understand was not distance. It was respect. In December, the judge came for his scheduled visit. He walked through the house. He spoke with Samuel alone in the kitchen. He reviewed the accounts with Delaney. He had coffee on the porch with Maeve and Corbett. "The boy is doing well," he said. "Better than I expected." "He's strong," Maeve said. "He is. He told me he's learning to fish." Vance looked at Corbett. "He also told me you're teaching him to identify bird calls by sound." Corbett looked slightly surprised, as if he hadn't thought that was notable enough to mention. "He wanted to know," he said. Vance looked between them. She'd gotten used to people doing this, trying to read something in the space between her and Corbett, looking for whatever they expected to find there. Usually she found it slightly tiresome. This time it didn't feel that way. "I'll be approving the guardianship as permanent," Vance said. "I'll close the formal review process unless there's cause to reopen it." He set down his cup. "Don't give me cause." "We won't," Maeve said. After Vance left, Samuel appeared in the doorway. "Is it okay?" he asked. "It's okay," Maeve said. "It's yours. This is your home." He looked at the yard, the barn, the long ridge behind the cottonwoods. He'd been looking at it for months, but something in his face now was different. Like a person who'd been renting a room in their own house and had just been handed the key. "Can Corbett stay for supper?" he asked. Maeve looked at Corbett. "If he'd like," she said. Corbett stayed for supper. He stayed late enough that riding back in the dark made less sense than not, and Porter had long since set up a cot in the spare room on a practical basis. And nobody commented on any of it, because everybody in the household had quietly stopped pretending that the arrangement had hard edges. It wasn't what she'd planned. She'd come here to do something necessary and specific, to make good on a debt she owed to a dead man's trust in her, to ensure a boy had solid ground to stand on. She hadn't planned to find herself with a reason to stay that was hers and not anyone else's. But she'd learned, in the long way of mistakes and correction, that the things you plan and the things worth having are often not the same list, and the bravest thing you can do is recognize which is which, while you still have time to choose. In the spring, they planted a kitchen garden. Samuel had requested tomatoes on the basis that they were the one food he would eat reliably in any form. Corbett planted them in the position with the best afternoon light without being asked, because he'd been paying attention. The three of them knelt in the turned earth on a Saturday morning, and Samuel asked questions that were the questions of a child who believed he had a future in this specific place. And Maeve answered them and Corbett answered them, and they contradicted each other twice on minor points of gardening, and Samuel declared that he would do it his own way and see which of them was right. She looked across the garden bed at Corbett. He was watching Samuel with the same expression she'd seen in the barn that first day, careful and real and slowly unguarded. He met her eyes. She didn't have words for what was in his face. Or maybe she did and was only now ready to admit them. But she knew this. She had come to Dalton Creek for Samuel, and she was staying for more than that now. And that was not a loss of purpose, but an expansion of it. The tomatoes grew well that summer. Samuel was insufferable about it. Some things break and stay broken. Some break and the cracks become part of the structure, the thing that holds the weight without hiding where it was tested. The three of them had come to each other broken in their different ways, and they were not fixed exactly. But they were standing. They were choosing each other every morning, and that was enough. That was more than enough. That was what it meant to be a family when nobody made you. There's a version of this story where Maeve says no, where she reads Theodore's letter, folds it back along its creases, and decides it isn't her responsibility. She had a life in Harrow's Bend, a practice, patients who needed her. Every reasonable argument pointed towards staying where she was. But I think about what that version of Maeve would have looked like 5 years later. Still running the same practice. Still waking up thinking about a boy named Charlie who ran into a barn in a blizzard because she waited 3 days to send a letter. Still carrying it, not because carrying guilt is inevitable, but because guilt that never gets answered just sits there and calcifies into something heavier than grief. The thing that strikes me most about what she did isn't the courage of it, though it took courage. It's the clarity. She knew exactly why she was saying yes. Not to feel better about herself. Not to fix the past. But because a 9-year-old boy was going to lose his home and his land and his father's name if nobody showed up. and she was the person Theodore had trusted to show up. That kind of moral honesty, knowing your own reasons, not dressing them up as something cleaner than they are, that's what I'd call real integrity, not the performance of doing the right thing. The actual reckoning with why you're doing it. Samuel understood that, even at 9. When she told him the truth about the arrangement with Corbett, he didn't cry or feel betrayed. He said, "You're doing it for the ranch." And she said, "Yes, partly." And he accepted that because a partial truth, honestly given, is worth more than a whole story dressed up to seem simpler than it is. That boy had been lied to by kindness his whole life. People telling him everything would be okay when they didn't know that. He knew the difference. Children almost always do. What Corbett brought to it was something different. He wasn't solving a problem. He was making a choice with his eyes open, knowing it was going to cost him something, knowing he was still tender from losing Josephine, knowing the situation was irregular and might get harder before it got easier. That kind of steadiness isn't something you're born with. It's built. It comes from having gone through something difficult and decided you're still going to be someone who shows up. That's the quality I think gets undervalued. Not bravery in the dramatic sense, but the willingness to keep going forward when you have every legitimate reason to stay still. And Maeve, what she was doing the whole time, even when she didn't know it, was learning to think past the immediate problem. Not just how do I protect Samuel from Hollis and Marsh today, but what does this boy need to become a person who can protect himself? That's a different kind of intelligence. Not the intelligence of knowing the right answer, but of asking the right question. What does this child actually need, not what would make this situation tidier? The three of them broke in their different ways before they ever found each other. Theodore's death, Josephine's fever, a classroom door a teacher was too careful to walk through in time. None of that went away. You don't get to trade in the broken parts for new ones, but you can decide what you build with them. I keep coming back to the garden at the end, the tomatoes planted in the afternoon light. Samuel insufferable about being right, the ordinary smallness of it. That's what all the courage and clarity and steadiness were in service of, not some grand resolution, just a morning in the dirt with people who had chosen each other. The harvest of everything they'd each decided to do right. That seems worth it to me. That seems like enough.